Let's break down every single running back, wide receiver, tight end, and quarterback that you could possibly need to add last minute off of the waiver wire going into week 10 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Whether you're looking for a player to stash, stream, or a player to potentially start here in week 10, here are your last minute waiver wire additions for week 10. All right, so let's kick the video off with Tyler Algier of the Atlanta Falcons coming in at 48% rostered. It's not particularly a great week to run to the waiver wire and have a starting running back that you're going to be able to pull off of the waiver wire. Hasn't really been that way in a couple weeks, but Algier gets a great matchup against the New Orleans Saints, who have been one of the worst run defenses over the past couple of weeks, allowing the 26th most fantasy points to the running back position. He had a touchdown in week 9. He had a double-digit fantasy performance in week 6 against another very bad run defense in the Carolina Panthers, and a double-digit performance in week 4 against the Saints, the team that we're looking to face here in week 10. So Algier, a desperation play at best. Don't get me wrong here if you're really going to have to fire him up in your starting lineup. But he's also a strong handcuff to Bijan Robinson, as he has been all season long. So if you're absolutely desperate, struggling at the running back position, Algier is one of those guys that you can throw into your lineup and cross your fingers. At the very worst, he's a good handcuff as we approach the end of the fantasy season. And another handcuff that I think you guys could grab off the waiver wire here in week 10 and cross your fingers on is going to be Ray Davis of the Buffalo Bills. We look in the past 4 weeks, double-digit fantasy performances 3 times for Ray Davis. But of course, we want to break that down a little bit further. Week 6 against the Jets, no James Cook. Ray Davis, the RB1, 18.2 fantasy points. James Cook has obviously been back since, but week 7, that garbage time touchdown against the Titans led to 11.7 fantasy points. Week 8, just 2.9 fantasy points. This past week, 17 fantasy points, but just 4 carries. He had that big catch and 2 total catches, which led to 70 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. So this week against the Colts, giving up the 17th most fantasy points to the running back position. If you're absolutely desperate, maybe we get some standalone value out of Ray Davis this week, sitting at 34% rostered. I could certainly see the Bills pulling ahead in this game, making a statement game here. Colts kind of in a weird spot at this point in the season, and maybe that leads to more involvement out of Ray Davis. But once again, this is a desperation play, as there's really nothing out there on the waiver wire at the position. And at the very least, similar to Tyler Algier, Ray Davis is a good handcuff at the running back position for the rest of the season. All right, next up, let's talk about Tyjae Spears, who still sits at 46% rostered. He's missed the past 3 weeks since he suffered an injury in week 6 against the Colts and has been dealing with that hamstring injury. But we look back to the previous 2 starts before the injury, 10.1 fantasy points in week 3, 11.9 fantasy points in week 4. So definitely not going to be able to start Tyjae Spears this week against the Chargers, giving up the second fewest fantasy points to the running back position. And it's a tough matchup over the next 2 weeks, getting the Vikings and the Texans. But ultimately, Tyjae Spears did show a little bit of standalone value before he suffered the injury. And Tony Pollard, although he was able to play this past week, has been dealing with some injuries himself. I think Tony Pollard is going to be fine, don't get me wrong. But as we kind of approach this final stretch of the season, we could start to see a little bit more involvement out of Tyjae Spears. At the same time, this Titans offense, Will Levis is starting again this week. I don't know what to expect here out of the Titans as the season progresses, but they have a pretty favorable playoff schedule. Even starting in week 14 before the fantasy playoffs start, they get Jacksonville, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and then Jacksonville again. So at the very end of the season, we could certainly see some involvement out of Tyjae Spears potentially, as I don't think the Titans are going to be a competitive team at that point in time. And if anything happens to Tony Pollard, then Tyjae Spears would be the next man up. So not a player that we're looking to start whatsoever here in week 10, but he could be a solid stash as we approach this final stretch of the year. All right, one more handcuff for you guys, and that is Trey Benson of the Arizona Cardinals, sitting at 25% rostered. Not going to start him this week against the Jets, giving up the 12th fewest fantasy points to the running back position, and he does have a bye week this next week in week 11. So I don't know that you need to run to the waiver wire or anything to stash Trey Benson this week. But if you are looking to stash a running back, I do think that Trey Benson is a viable option. We look to the end of the season, right? We've got some really strong matchups: the Seattle Seahawks, the New England Patriots, the Carolina Panthers, and the LA Rams from a stretch of weeks 14 through 17. So don't get me wrong, the other guy involved here is Amari DeMarcado, and if something were to happen to James Conner, we would probably see touches to both Amari DeMarcado and Trey Benson. And some people are like, who in the world is Amari DeMarcado, this random player who scored a touchdown in week 9? But don't forget, DeMarcado had some splashes in his rookie season last year, weeks 5, 7, 15, and 16. He had double-digit fantasy performances, and there was a point last year where Amari DeMarcado was a waiver wire addition at the running back position. So, yeah, this past week, kind of weird. Trey Benson had a touchdown, and Amari DeMarcado had a touchdown as well. So who knows exactly what would happen if something went happened to James Conner, but Trey Benson, I think, has a little bit more upside in his rookie season. Tough to say, but that stretch at the end of the season, in terms of strength of schedule for the Cardinals running back, is definitely there. So if you're looking to stash a running back in a deeper format where you have more bench options, I think that Trey Benson is certainly an option here in week 10. Let's move along to the wide receiver position, and we got to start with Jauan Jennings, who does come in at 65% rostered, so a little bit higher rostered overall, but man, this matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is beautiful this week, as they are allowing the 25th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. And then we look at the fact that Deebo Samuel is still listed as questionable, dealing with 2 different injuries going into week 10. Don't forget, he had to leave early in week 8 against Dallas, and he's had a full week of rest as the Niners are coming off their bye week. So don't get me wrong, it's Deebo. There's still a very strong chance that he plays. But either way, Jennings is either going to be your wide receiver 1 or your wide receiver 2 this week against a very, very bad Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary. So that's going to lead, I think, almost a lock for double digits this week for Jauan Jennings. Now, don't get me wrong, George Kittle is healthy. Christian McCaffrey's coming back. There's plenty of mouths to feed in this offense, but the Niners are going to try to make a statement here on the road against the Bucs, as they are looking to get as many wins as possible, as they are barely leading their division right now. So I think Jennings, if he's out there, is a great player who has a lot of upside this week. Has still averaged 13.9 fantasy points per game so far on the season. Missed week 7 and 8. Bye week in week 9 for the Niners, like I said, so there's definitely a chance that he might be floating out there on the waiver wire in your respective leagues. If he is, I think he's a player that we can pick up and play with confidence here in week 10. Also love Jauan Jennings' current lines on Underdog. I would be running over to Underdog to take the over on his receiving yards, sitting at 42.5 total receiving yards, especially if we find out that Deebo Samuel does not play this week. I think Jennings to score a touchdown. Jennings' total receptions are also good lines. Make sure you guys head straight to Underdog to take the over on Jennings' total receiving yards. And Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 10's action. Take your free Pick'em, take the over on Jennings' total receiving yards. Once both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch are also getting a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So it's a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 10's action, and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you guys sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. All right, next up, let's talk about Quentin Johnston of the LA Chargers, still coming in at 57% rostered, coming off of a Week 9 performance where he had 22 fantasy points against the Cleveland Browns, 5 targets, 4 catches, 118 receiving yards, and a touchdown. I definitely think that Johnston is a player that at the very least we want to try and get on our bench, on our roster. Tough matchup this week, as the Titans have given up the second fewest fantasy points to the running back position so far on the season. But I would be going and trying to add Quentin Johnston, and I do think he's a viable starter here in Week 10 as well. Maybe the upside not as high going into the week with this matchup, but I still think that Quentin Johnston is a good start. And we had talked about going out and adding Quentin Johnston last week before that performance. Just don't forget, early in the season, Quentin Johnston, Justin Herbert, very good chemistry overall. I think he's a good, strong start this week if there's nothing out there better for you. And I would also take a look at Josh Palmer at the same time, who sits at 20% rostered. He's had 9.2 or more fantasy points in his last 3 starts. Also scored 14.3 fantasy points this past week while scoring a touchdown, 4 targets, 2 catches, 63 receiving yards. So if you're in a bind, both the Chargers wide receivers who might be available in Quentin Johnston and Josh Palmer could certainly be viable starting options here in Week 10. Third player that I think is a viable starting option here in Week 10 is Xavier Legette of the Carolina Panthers, who comes in at 54% rostered. He's had double-digit fantasy performances in 3 of his last 4 games. 3 touchdowns in his last 4 games as well. 13.9 fantasy points in Week 9. 6 targets, 4 grabs, and a touchdown, sitting at 54% rostered, a little bit higher overall in terms of roster percentage. But ultimately, right now, no Adam Thielen in Week 10. Jalen Coker barely made a dent in Week 9 with just 3 targets and 2 catches. Jatavion Sanders at the tight end position is really the next player on this team getting targets. So Xavier Legette really comes in as a wide receiver 1. It's a good enough matchup this week against the Giants in that early morning game. This is still a team that is struggling against the wide receiver position, giving up the 22nd most fantasy points to wide receivers. So I like Xavier Legette this week. I think he's a player that we could plug in the flex. Maybe doesn't have the highest ceiling, but with 13.4 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts, could certainly be a viable starting option as we get into Week 10. Next up, we have Demarcus Robinson of the LA Rams coming in at 44% rostered. This was another player we talked about adding going into Week 9. He obviously had the very big week with Puka Nacua not seeing as much action, leaving the game early. 9 targets, 6 grabs, 94 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 27.4 fantasy points at the game-winning touchdown, all of that stuff. He is listed as questionable going into the week as he deals with 2 different injuries, a toe and hip injury, but he has been practicing at this point in time in a limited capacity. It is a tough matchup this week. He had 2 good matchups in a row there against the Vikings and the Seahawks. It's a tougher matchup this week against the Miami Dolphins, giving up the 4th fewest fantasy points to the position. So I do think that his upside is a bit limited, but after this week, a couple good matchups here: Patriots, Eagles, and the Saints, all in 3 games in a row there. So I still think Demarcus Robinson is going to be one of these players that we can spot play as the season progresses here against poor secondaries. So I do think he deserves to be rostered, and at the very least, if you're absolutely desperate, he has averaged 10.5 fantasy points per game on the season. You could plug him in. A little bit risky due to the matchup and the fact that Puka's probably not going to be throwing punches this week and getting kicked out of the game and all that stuff. So I do like Robinson going into the week, but I think his upside is far more capped in this matchup against the Dolphins here in Week 10. All right, last wide receiver I want to talk about is Sterling Shepard of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I do think he is a flex option as we go into the week. He sits at just 25% rostered, so he's a player that you might be able to pick up, plug in off of the waiver wire. The Niners are giving up the 20th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, so it's certainly not a bad matchup this week, and vice versa, right? We already talked about Tampa Bay giving up a lot of points to the wide receiver position. I think we could certainly see some points scored overall by both teams in this game. Now, last week, Jalen McMillan did not play, dealing with a hamstring injury, and he's listed as questionable going into the week. And while that may not seem like a huge factor, as McMillan has really only done so much with 7 total grabs in the absence of Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, but at the same time, he's had 7 or more targets in his last 2 starts as well. So the volume will be affected by Shepard, but there's a strong chance that McMillan doesn't even play this week because the Buccaneers have their bye week in Week 11. So if he needs to continue to nurse this injury, it's definitely viable that he sits through the week as well. But even if he does play, I still think there's enough volume here for Shepard to have a good game. Shepard's had 5 targets in his last 2 games, 10.9 fantasy points against the Chiefs in Week 9, so a double-digit performance. Not a high ceiling play here, but I like the game script here. The matchup's good enough. and he had double digits this past week. So if you're in a bind, you need somebody to throw in last minute. Sterling Shepard, although the ceiling is not very high, could certainly be your guy as we move in to week 10. I lied to you guys. I actually have one more wide receiver, and that is Noah Brown of the Washington Commanders, coming in at 16% rostered. We talked about him in the sneaky starts video, and I do think he's very risky going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers, who still have a very good pass defense, giving up the 11th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. But Noah Brown, double digits in the past 2 weeks, 6 targets in each of the last 2 games. 11 fantasy points against the Giants. I know you look at week 8, yeah, he had double digits, but the Hail Mary, all that, whatever, he still had the Hail Mary, right? He's definitely risky this week, but if you're in a deeper format, you need somebody to plug in. He is looking like the wide receiver 2 for the Washington Commanders. Still a great offense. We've really been looking for a wide receiver outside of Terry McLaurin to step up and be a viable option in this offense and hopefully turn into a viable fantasy option as well. So maybe pump the brakes. Maybe we're not quite there with Noah Brown, but he's certainly looking like the closest option overall. So risky option. This is for you guys in like 16-team formats, but I do think that Noah Brown could put up a respectable stat line at home against the Steelers in week 10. Okay, let's move along to the tight end position. Let's start with Taysom Hill of the New Orleans Saints, coming in at 46% roster. I'm always a little shaky about getting on the Taysom Hill train because it is a pretty shaky ride, but 16 fantasy points against the Carolina Panthers in week 9, who really struggled against the tight end position. 5 targets, 4 receptions, 41 receiving yards, and ultimately, while you guys are looking at the screen, I'm not sure why player profile is showing that he has had no targets or receptions this year, so ignore that. But ultimately, this past week as well, very good matchup against the Carolina Panthers, as they were one of the worst teams against opposing tight ends so far on the season. Actually, the worst team against opposing tight ends on the season, giving up the most fantasy points to the position. But this week, another strong matchup against the Atlanta Falcons, giving up the 24th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So once again, a very strong matchup. And the last time that the Saints played the Falcons in week 4, Taysom Hill had 14.4 fantasy points. So we still got a lot of injuries on this team. Chris Olave not going to play this week. We know that. They really don't have any depth at wide receiver. Maybe we can keep an eye on Mason Tipton. MVS, it's not looking very bright. Cedric Wilson's not out or is not playing this week as he's out. So don't really think there's a stash at the wide receiver position on this team. So it's going to be Taysom Hill who they're going to try and get utilized. We know that. You need a flyer at the tight end position. I'm willing to risk it this week with the amount of injuries and the matchup. Taysom Hill, I think, is a strong streaming option at the tight end position here in week 10. All right, next up is Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots, currently the tight end 11 so far on the season. He comes in at 51% rostered, and I really like picking up Hunter Henry right now. I don't think he has a massive ceiling by any stretch, and it's a tough matchup this week against the Bears, but they have moved back against the tight end position. They were one of the top 5 teams, but they've moved back to 17th, so it's not a great matchup, but it's certainly not a bad matchup. And what we want to look at here is the fact that Drake May is the starting quarterback. He's back in action. So in games where Drake May is the starting quarterback, Hunter Henry is 12.6 or more fantasy points. And in his last start with Drake May limited or had to leave early, he still had 9.5 fantasy points. So I think Hunter Henry should be rostered in more formats. Once again, the ceiling is not crazy high here, but he's a player that we can plug in and almost expect double digits out of when Drake May is the starting quarterback, and that's the plan for the rest of the season. So I think he's almost more valuable than most of the Patriots wide receivers for the rest of the season. So I think Henry, a strong pickup, a good start this week, has another good matchup against the Rams in week 11. So if he's out there and available, I think he's a strong add and a strong start at the tight end position here in week 10. I also love Hunter Henry's current reception line on Underdog, sitting at 4.5 total receptions. He has hit that in his last 3 games. I don't see any reason why he can't hit that this week against the Bears. So I'll be heading straight to Underdog to take the over on Hunter Henry's total receptions. And don't forget, like I said earlier, guys, use that link down below. Get your free NFL Pick'em for the week when you guys sign up on Underdog with promo code TheCatch. Take your free Pick'em. Take the over on Henry's receptions. Once both of those hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're doing so, as long as you guys sign up with promo code TheCatch, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. All right, one last tight end for you guys. That's Jonnu Smith of the Miami Dolphins. Wanted to throw someone in here who's a little bit lower rostered overall. Comes in at 31% rostered. A great matchup against the LA Rams, giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the tight end position. So Jonnu Smith in his last 4 starts, 6 or more fantasy points, 9.6 or more fantasy points in 3 of those. 6 or more targets in every game since week 5. So his involvement in this offense is certainly still there. This is obviously not a high ceiling play, but maybe due to the matchup, it could turn into a high ceiling play. At the very least, this is a player. You got nothing going on at the tight end position this week. You're in a desperate spot. You should be able to run to the waiver wire, add him, plug him in for the week, and play him in a good matchup. So once again, not my favorite start, but wanted to include somebody that you guys could actually have a very strong chance of picking up off the waiver wire and throwing in if you're in a desperate spot. So if you're in that type of spot, I think Jonnu Smith is the play here in week 10. Let's move along to the quarterback position. And you know what? I got to do this. I got to say, if you need a streaming option this week that you can stream, Daniel Jones coming in against the Carolina Panthers in that early morning game overseas against the Panthers, giving up the 29th most fantasy points to the quarterback position. He sits at 28% rostered. He's coming off of a game in week 9 against the Commanders where he had 24.3 fantasy points, 174 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 54 yards on the ground, and a rushing touchdown. So there's plenty of risk here. We look over the past 4 starts, 12.8 or less fantasy points in 3 games, then the splash play this past week against the Commanders. But we've seen Daniel Jones against weak defenses on the season have some value. Plenty of risk here because this is still the Giants. You can have a bum week at any point. This is Daniel Jones. You can have a bum week at any point, but the matchup is there. These overseas games tend to be a bit wonky. We got 2 bad defenses involved here. Should be a positive game script for Daniel Jones and company. So if you need a desperation play, especially in a super flex double quarterback format, then Daniel Jones, I think, is a good streaming option due to matchup. I know if you guys watch the QB tight end video, start sits for the week, I had Daniel Jones as a sit, like I'm just staying away. But retrospectively, kind of thought about it. I'm like, this matchup is here. We like to start quarterbacks against the Panthers. So if you need to do so, I would cross your fingers and say I think Daniel Jones is a strong streaming option here in week 10. All right, last week we talked about Aaron Rodgers as a strong start against the Houston Texans. If you needed to stream a quarterback, he came through with 211 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and 20 fantasy points. This week he gets the Arizona Cardinals, giving up the 21st most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. This Cardinals defense has been a little bit kind of like up and down and has looked okay the past couple weeks. So maybe there's some risk here because the Jets are on the road. The Cardinals have also, for the most part, struggled against opposing running backs. So we'll see what the pass game looks like here. But I think if Rodgers is out there and available for the most part, he's been pretty solid in his last 3 starts with 17 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 starts, 2 or more passing touchdowns in 3 of his last 4 starts as well. We started to see that pass game come together a little bit more. Big game out of Devontae Adams in week 9. I think Garrett Wilson's been fine, but also a huge game out of Garrett Wilson in week 9. So if Rodgers is out there, you're struggling at the position this week, I do think he's a strong start in week 10. That'll do it for today's video. There are your last minute waiver wire additions for week 10 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Don't forget, guys, I'll be answering all comments in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 10, drop me a comment. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.